யார் வேணாலும் நீங்கள் இந்த படத்தெல்லாம் யூஸ் பண்ணிக்கலாம் தாராளமாக. நிறைய படங்கள் நான் வெளியிருந்து வெப்பில் இருந்து எடுத்தது, only for educational purposes, and I think we are free to use for that. ஓகே, ஹெரிட்டேஜ்னா அதுக்கு எவ்வளோ ஒரு காலத்துக்கு முன்னால் நம்ம ஹெரிட்டேஜ் சொல்கிறோம். how old is heritage? மேலே இருக்கிற பூ கெப்பாரிஸ், பல்லவர்கள் மாலையாக போட்டுக்கொண்ட பூ. அது நம்ம ஊரில் இருக்கிறதுக்கு ஆதொண்டைன்னு சொல்லுவாங்க, தொண்டைப்பூன்னு சொல்லுவாங்க. 1978 எங்கள் ஸ்டூடெண்ட்ஸ்லாம் அதை படிக்கும்பொழுது அந்த பூவை பறித்து ஒரு மாலை செஞ்சு ஒரு பெண்ணுக்கு போட்டோம். அது ரொம்ப நேரம் நிற்காது, கொஞ்ச நேரம் தான் அது பூவாக இருக்கும். பல்லவ கிங்ஸ் என்ன பண்ணியிருப்பார், ஒரு வேளை அது கோல்டு இல்லை இதெல்லாம் செஞ்சு போட்டுக்கிட்டு இருந்திருப்பார். இதுதான் பல்லவருடைய மாலை. கீழே பார்த்தீங்கன்னா காந்தல், அந்த பக்கம் பார்த்தீங்கன்னா மாமல்லபுரம், அதுவும் ஒரு ஹெரிட்டேஜ் தான். இங்கே லெஃப்டில் பார்த்தீங்கன்னா ஒரு மரம் இப்போ பூத்து கிடக்குது. செய்யாறிலிருந்து ஆரணிக்கு போகிற வழியில் போனீங்கன்னா ஒரு 40 மரம் பூத்துக்கிட்டு இருக்கு. எங்களுக்கு அதுவும் ஒரு ஹெரிட்டேஜ் தான். எங்கேருந்து வந்துச்சுன்னு தெரியாது, இப்போ படிச்சுக்கிட்டு இருக்கிறோம். அதை இன்னும் கொஞ்ச நாளில் அதை பற்றி எழுதுவோம். எவல்யூஷன், the story of our grand heritage, because it goes beyond any time that we are using to study our heritage. American Indians, அவங்களுக்கு பேர் வக்கோண்டா. வக்கோண்டா இஸ் த பிக் ஸ்பிரிட். அந்த ஸ்பிரிட்டுக்குள்ள தான் எல்லா ஸ்பிரிட்டும் இருந்துச்சான், including human beings, animals, plants, and everything that you can think. And that spirit was looking for a place to settle down. And eventually somehow water came, land came, and Wakonda came and settled down. That's how the earth became live with plants, animals, and people. That's a myth. A good myth. All of us must have a good myth, otherwise we don't understand the world. And that's part of our heritage. Cosmogenesis is the word that's usually used under peripheral, all the mythologies. Every country has its mythology, and Gopu would be interested. For some reason, we don't have such good mythologies in Sangam literature. Tamil literature is unique in not having a good heritage story. Anyway, such stories talk about cosmic mating, birth, egg. It's very primal, ex nihilo. It's out of the chaos, out of the underworld, out of evil, death, and blood, through the thought process of a god. Snakes, water, clouds, mountains, cyclical. These are all the stories that go into mythology. But this mythology can be traced back only for about 5,000 years to major civilizations. Maybe you can add a few more, but I've shown here the Harappan civilization and the Mesopotamian, which is supposed to be slightly earlier. But wherever you go, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, people started imagining and building up stories about their past and where they came from. And that's all our heritage is. Whether you talked about modern science, you talk about our Indian mythology, our Greek mythology, these are all. But that's restrictive for a biologist. Because if you talk about me or any other living thing and these plants, our history stretches far, far back. And that's one reason why we are interested in evolution. And the man who gave this heritage that takes us back to 3 billion years or 4 billion years, and the other people who added to this from the physical science world that takes life beyond a period when there was no life into 13 billion years or 13.5 billion years are the scientists who gave us a worldview. Newton may have been a person who was very religious, and he was. But then without his understanding ideas about mathematics and light and the nature of the light, we won't be able to comprehend the world or see the color that you saw just now. That's why we celebrate February 12th as the Darwin Day, International Darwin Day. The aim of this celebration is to reflect and act on the principles of intellectual bravery and not get confused with all kinds of mythological base. to have a perpetual curiosity to understand the world as Darwin had all through his life, and explore and use scientific thinking, hunger for truth as embodied in Charles Darwin, a day of celebration, activism, and international cooperation for the advancement of science, education, and human welfare. All of this was dear to Darwin. In 2009, we had the 150th year since his publication. Since then, every year, all over the world, people are celebrating the Darwin Day. February happens to be very important for us Indians, because 28th of February is the National Science Day. That's the day Sir C.V. Raman discovered light scattering. Raman not just stopped with light and physics. Like Darwin, he had other interests. One of the things that he studied was flower color, especially those that had violet and purple colors. He was interested in using his spectrophotometer to study what kind of a scattering effect takes place on this kind of a color, and he published articles. And one of his little studies came up in a newspaper those days. And I was a young lecturer. And when you are young, you don't hesitate to write to big people. So I wrote to him, and he sent me back a letter, one of my precious possessions. This he sent me in 1969, and it gave me a reference to where I can get further information on his studies on the spectrum of the flowers. I often show this, I don't want to be critical, but in 2011 I gave a lecture in the ISRO Science Forum on space biology and why India should take up space biology. And I sent my letter to about 20 different organizations and 20 different scientists, not a single reply. This is the world that we live in today. Nobody saw a monkey turn into a human. This is what we heard last year. 51A of our Constitution, fundamental duty, says it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to develop the scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform. Of course, people criticized Darwin also and said, now how do you say monkeys and apes evolved into humans? The single most important subject in biology is evolution. Probably in all sciences, because that gives us a platform to see the world past and present, and for some people to see the future also. Dobzhansky, a Russian geneticist and evolutionary biologist, said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That was in 1973, and it is true today. It's even more true today. You can be studying bacteriophages, or you can be studying human beings. You simply cannot escape evolution because that's the basic principle that governs. I'm going to summarize all that I'm going to show in the next several slides, what this evolution is all about. Life has a history that can be measured in billions of years. So that's your heritage. All life, including the more than 30 million living species, we don't know the exact number, and about 600 million that had gone extinct. More species have gone extinct than they are living today. They are all truly organically related to each other. All life share about 500 genes, humans included. That flower that I showed you and that fossil that went extinct 250 million years ago is my relative. And that fossil had same genes that I have. Otherwise, that would not have lived. Otherwise, I wouldn't be living. The biodiversity of the Earth, that is the variations we observe at the genetic, species, and higher taxonomic levels, and even ecosystem levels, they are all products of evolution. So you cannot understand environment, environmental protection, and ecosystem, and forest, and Western Ghats unless you also understand that this is a product of evolution. Even the more recently evolved species, human beings, with extraordinary mental skills, consciousness, and achievements too are part of this history and heritage. We had our beginnings in a simple amoeba-like cell, and Darwin said so at the end of his book, and I will show his quote later on. The green color of plants and the color of many flowers are due to the presence of cell components that were once free-living bacteria. And I'm going to show you a slide, and this is amazing. I am not what I am. I am not a single person. Every one of my cells has bacteria that entered my ancestral cells long ago. That was not something that Darwin knew at that time, but that's what we know since then. It's now possible to trace our origins, ancestry, and routes of migration, and construct family trees by analyzing our DNA. There you are today, and life started there about 3.8 billion years ago, and the Earth was born just a little before that. And then the Big Bang, so-called, 13 billion years ago or so. So look how long the heritage of life is. Not 5,000 years, but 3.8 billion years. And to know that we are here only because this happened there is a true heritage. Darwin traveled on his voyage, starting from here, coming to Africa, going to Australia, going back South America and Galapagos Islands, and turning back to Plymouth. He was on a ship for 5 years. He had a few books that he could read with him. And one of the most important books that he had was Charles Lyell's book on geology. He was the greatest geologist at that time. And he was the one who said it takes millions of years to form the Earth's crust. And Darwin was highly influenced by that, because when he put forward his theory of evolution, which required long periods of time, he was happy that Lyell had already said this. And Lyell was one of his strongest supporters at a later time when he came back. And this is the ship captain, friend of his. He was much junior. Until the end, the captain never believed what Darwin said about human evolution. You talk about plant and animal evolution, okay, I will agree. But human beings are very special. They couldn't have evolved through the process that you are talking about. Around this time, there was another great mind, Charles Wallace. He was studying organisms that are in the Indian Ocean, Indonesia, Malaysian archipelago, etc. And out of his theories came what we now call today as paleozoogeography, how the animals are distributed in the world. And Wallace knew about Darwin. Wallace sent his write-up on what he thinks evolution is all about. Darwin had come back in 1837, was writing his work. He had a tragedy in his house. Daughters had died. He was taking his time, and suddenly a letter comes from Charles Wallace. And he reads the memoir, almost 100% the same as what Darwin himself has proposed. Identical views on evolution. He didn't know what to do. He went to his friend Lyell. He went to his friend Thomas Huxley. And they said, go ahead, immediately publish so you can get your priority. And he said, no, I can't do that, because that would be trying to cheat my friend who had sent this letter. So they arranged for a meeting at one time so both can present their papers. Unfortunately, Darwin could not go because the day before the daughter died, I think. Charles Wallace, he presented his paper. Later on, Darwin put together and published his major work in 1859. But in all later publication, Wallace always recognized that it was Darwin who wrote before me, who thought before me, and said he had done it in that thorough fashion more than what I had done. So they remained friends. Of course, Wallace never agreed with human evolution. He still could not believe that human beings evolved through the same process that Darwin was talking about. He thought there must have been some special force when it came to human beings, very similar to what the Catholic Church believes now. The Catholic Church now believes evolution happen. But something special must have happened when it came to human beings, because if it did not happen, you can't have soul. And if you can't have soul, many other things collapse. Some of Darwin's book, it's not as though Charles Darwin wrote only Origin of Species. You can see from this, I won't go into all of them, but he wrote about many things. One of the taxonomy work that he did was on those little barnacles that get stuck on your boat. Nobody in the right mind would want to study it. How to distinguish the species between one barnacle and another barnacle. He studied about geology, how the coral reefs are formed. He studied about insects. He studied about pollination. He studied about power of movement in plants. And then, of course, in Galapagos Islands, he was studying about the beak of the finches. So he wrote many books. Unbelievable. I cannot even read all of his work during one's lifetime. But this is the Origin of Species, 1859. And he produced additional volumes in 61, 66, 69, 72. And every time he made minor revisions, and he acknowledged information that was not there in an earlier edition, he included. And in his preface, if you read, he talked about who are all his predecessors who thought and wrote things that are similar to evolution. His own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, talked about evolution. The idea of evolution was there hanging around, but it was never put in the way that Darwin did. The day in 1859 the book was published, all copies were sold. So we are talking about a time 150 years ago where people were keenly interested and hungry for new information in England. This is the reason why that country and other countries were able to advance in modern science so well. And his books were sent to America, and they were also sold there. It's not as though everybody disliked the book. Most people liked the book. They were looking for information of this nature. Therefore, evolution is a master theory in biology. It's not a theory. Even today, we call it evolutionary theory or Darwinian theory of evolution, but the word theory is not applicable here. Evolution is a fact. You ask any scientist, they will tell you it's a fact. What's a theory? The theory is what is the mechanism that moved the fact of evolution. The fact of evolution is from simple organisms evolve. But how they evolve is the theory part of it. But even there is some consensus now. And to put it very simply, descent with modification. All living things, including humans, are descendants of common ancestors. Population can change over time and evolve into species. What's the mechanism? Natural selection. Darwin stuck to this till his death. Can human beings also evolve by natural selection? Yes. Can human behavior evolve by natural selection? Yes. Can qualities of human love and various things that we talk about can be part of natural selection? He said yes. Horizontal gene transfer is something I will mention later on that was not known during Darwin's time. Epigenetics is very new science that is coming up. I won't talk much about that. These are chromosomes. They were not known to Darwin well. This is human chromosome. Once the chromosomes were identified, then people were looking for what's the chemical in it. Once the chemical were identified, they were looking for what's the structure of the chemical in it. And that's how we now got the double helix, DNA. This is the paper, the whole paper in Nature. And that's what got Nobel Prize for Watson and Crick. One paper that explained how the double helix is there and how it duplicates. And later on, scientists were able to study all aspects of this. Now today's newspaper says in Mysore, you can rent an instrument, a DNA analyzer, pay for it, and you can take a tiny piece of DNA, you can amplify it. This is routinely going on now. Now everything is done at the micro level with microchips and computer associated. Then just before the DNA came in, there was Mendel, who discovered the principles of transferring of hereditary material. This was not known to Darwin. He was struggling. There is variation and there is selection acting on them, but how does the variation come? He didn't know. Actually, Mendel had already published it. It wasn't well communicated. Had they met each other together, then of course Darwin would have been happier to say a little more things about the evolutionary process. But Mendel's laws, and then using these laws in statistical and mathematical analysis, so that population genetics can come. Because Darwin didn't think of one species, suddenly one individual becoming another individual. It's a whole population. Out of this population, there is variation. To study how the genes are distributed in this population, you need statistical analysis. And that's what Hardy and Weinberg and many other people came to give. Now, here is a typical cell, human cell, plant cell, anything. Look at one cell here. This is the smallest biology I will give today. There's a nucleus. And here is a bacterium. That's another organism that's living outside. And this cell takes in the bacterium to eat it. Or the bacterium goes into the cell to kill it and eat it. We don't know which one is happening. But once it is inside, the cell keeps it happily. And the mitochondrion says, I will stay here as my home because I get enough food from the cell. And I will give you to the cell my capacity, which is I can generate energy for you. We call this as mitochondrion. I have billions of mitochondrion. Every one of my cells is now producing energy. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to speak because I have mitochondrion. And that mitochondrion was once upon a time a free-living bacterium. This is what we call as endosymbiosis. That was not known to Darwin. But endosymbiosis, once that happened in the very early period, about 3 billion years ago, organisms could start now diversifying and multiplying. Here is a cell with nucleus, its own nucleus, and it has taken in a bacterium which has become a mitochondrion. It's now trying to take in another bacterium. This bacterium is a chlorophyll-containing bacterium, so it can make its own food. Now the cell takes that in, now it can make its own food also. And that becomes a plant. So every plant has a bacterial mitochondria for producing energy. In addition, it has a bacterial chloroplast for producing food. So when you eat next time murungakkira, be happy that what you are eating is a bacterium which has just produced food for you there inside. And there was a bacterium inside the moringa leaf which has given energy for the cell to do this and the plant to grow this. And you and I or any organism is not one organism. We are a very complex organism. That's a heritage. That heritage goes back to 3 billion years. I mean, in fact, if you go back, this human sperm, some people think, also was a free-living bacterium which can swim around, which once entered the human cell. And without that swimming sperm, we probably wouldn't have done the reproduction that we are capable of. So now you have mitochondrion entering the cell, and this man cannot do all the big actings that you do as a macho without that energy producing stuff in there. And then a tulip flower or any flower plant cannot be beautiful without a bacterium which has entered as a plastid. I would often think, and Darwin would have agreed if he was there, and I will show you one quotation later on because he didn't know about this process, but he had a very special heart for plants. I would think this plant is far superior than any of us because it's capable of doing two things, energy generation as well as food generation. We cannot do the food generation. If you have a patch of chloroplast here and exposed to sun, make our food, then the world will be different. So what happened? In the early days, LUCA is the last universal common ancestor. That's what the scientists say. Biologists think that there was one final organism long, long ago which gave rise to everything that is living on Earth today and that went extinct. And from that came this bacteria which are still living with us. And some of this bacteria entered this cell, and from out of that came various groups. Less than one human genome is today because of this horizontal transfer of genes. We won't go into that again. Evolution gave us an Earth full of life, and that's part of the heritage of evolution. Biodiversity is a product of evolution. The love for all living creatures is the most noble attribute of man. This is what Darwin said. You look at any organism, they couldn't be here on this earth with us without the process of evolution. And you look at your body, 200 genera, 1,000 species are living on our skin. You simply cannot get rid of them. You may think you just wash with a soap and you put the scent on your body. No. Even if you do, even if you got rid of 1 million bacteria, within the next half an hour they will be multiplying. And the bacteria that's in the back of your ear is very different from that that's growing on here, because your secretion here is different from the secretion there. Life is everywhere. They like to sit there and start evolving. A child is almost sterile only at the moment when it is born. A few minutes after that, organisms take over. You have all kinds of organisms growing in your tongue, in your cheek, in your stomach, and all over your surface of the body. You go to Mamallapuram, the Pallava kings knew this. And that's where the monkey is there. Another monkey is looking at the pain on the tale and Laos. And these are my cousins, and they were looking at that. And in 1978, I had a girl in my class, botany class, who was always scratching her head. I said, "What's the problem, sir? Thalayila pain pogave maatungadu." So I said, "Give me some of your pain." And then this is a scanning electron microscope picture of the pain. This has evolved to be on your head, and that's the ecosystem. If you want to get rid of this ecosystem because you don't want Laos, then this will go extinct. And we are trying to ask this to go extinct, and most of them manage, especially my friends here who have bald heads. They made sure that at least one little living thing doesn't have a place there. And this one, if you look at it carefully, every little structure on its body has evolved to cling on to that, to suck the blood, to lay the egg, and the egg has got material cement to adhere to your hair. Oh, that is the bacterium. These are the bacteria on your tongue, seen by an electron microscope.